The prairie wind moaned like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bite of dust and the faint copper smell of old rain. A lone rancher rode slow beneath a bruised sky, reins slack in his hand, his horse's hooves sinking into the red clay. In his coat pocket was the deed to a cabin. 12 cents, and a signature had made it his. A bargain, the locals had called it, a steal. But as he crested the ridge and saw the cabin squatting like a scar against the horizon, he felt a weight settle in his chest. Some bargains carried a curse. The door gave way with a groan, hinges long starved of oil. Lantern light spilled into the darkness, pushing shadows across the bare wooden floor. The smell hit him first, stale rope, sweat, and something heavier, something that clung to the air like guilt. He lifted the lantern higher, and that was when he saw her. She hung from the rafters. Tall, impossibly tall, her head brushing against the beams even in death. An Apache girl, no more than 17, her long black hair spilling down like a dark river. The crude rope bit into her neck, twisting her face into silence. Her bare feet swung above the floorboards, toes inches from touching the earth. The lantern flame trembled as the rope creaked, a slow, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the cabin's ribs. The rancher's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing not with fear, but with the kind of sorrow that hardens into rage. He had buried too many bodies on this frontier. Children, mothers, men cut down for land or cattle. But this was no outlaw's punishment. This was a message. He stepped forward, boots scuffing the dust, the lantern's glow catching carved marks in the wood, lines, symbols, warnings left by hands that wanted him to see. He reached for his knife, slicing the rope, lowering her gently to the floor. Her weight was nothing compared to the weight of what had been done here. That cabin was no bargain. It was a tomb, and as the lantern flickered, the question rose like thunder in his mind. Who killed her? And why leave her here for him to find? The rope gave way with a brittle snap, and the girl's body dropped into the rancher's arms. She was heavy, almost as if the cruel weight of her suffering clung to her still. He lowered her gently onto the rough planked floor, lantern light trembling across her face. Her skin bore the marks of violence, but her features were calm now, eerily calm. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rattle of the storm shutters, wind scraping grit against the cabin walls. Then came footsteps. Slow, cautious, and many. The door creaked open and shadows filled the threshold. A small band of survivors stepped in, dust-streaked, wary-eyed, each with a weapon half raised. The rancher straightened, hand hovering near his revolver. They took in the sight at his feet, the girl stretched out like a fallen statue, and their faces hardened. To them, this was no sanctuary. It was a tomb. A fiery young woman, eyes burning red from smoke or rage, spat words like bullets. You knew, didn't you? That's why this shack sold for pennies. You knew she was here. The rancher's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady, like a man who had carried too much grief to be rattled by accusation. I didn't know. Not a damn word of it. Still, mistrust crackled in the air like gunpowder waiting on a spark. The maternal woman, older, worn but strong, pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, muttering about curses, about blood that never washes out of wood. The quiet hunter said nothing, only eyed the ceiling beams as though searching for more ghosts. Debate sparked like a brush fire. Some wanted to burn the cabin down then and there, to leave the cursed ground smoldering behind them. Others argued it was the only shelter for miles and the storm outside was growing teeth. The rancher stood silent through it all, eyes fixed on the girl's body, as if her presence alone demanded he hold his ground. Finally, he spoke. This place was built to break us apart. Whoever put her here wanted fear to do the killing. We can stay and fight that. Or we can run and let them win. The words hung in the stale lantern glow. No one answered right away. In that silence, the cabin shifted, no longer just walls and a roof, but a crucible of suspicion and survival. They were together, but trust was brittle as glass. One wrong move, one whispered doubt, and it would shatter. The rancher drew the blanket up over the girl's body. He didn't speak again, but the gesture said enough. Whether this cabin became their tomb or their fortress would depend on the fragile threads of trust they chose to weave or to cut. The lantern hissed and popped in the center of the cabin, its glow fighting against the black prairie night pressing through the cracks in the walls. 4 faces sat in its flickering circle, weathered, scarred, and half hidden in shadow. Outside, the wind dragged the timbers of the old cabin into a groan, like the building itself was alive and remembering. The rancher spoke first, his voice low, steady, the kind of tone that didn't waste words. "I didn't buy this place for land or timber," he said, eyes fixed on the lantern flame. "I bought it because I wanted silence. I had a family once. Raiders took 'em when I was out chasing strays. Came back to nothing but smoke and a rope nailed to my own doorframe." His hand tightened around the coffee tin, knuckles white. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The weight of his story sank into every corner of that room. The woman sitting nearest to him shifted, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her hair was streaked with gray, though she wasn't old, her face lined not by age but by grief. She stared at the rough-hewn floorboards before whispering, "I was a wife. I was a mother." She paused, lips trembling before hardening into stone. Settlers came, promised protection. When the dust rose, they were gone. My boy didn't make it. My husband neither. Now all I carry is their memory, and the fire it leaves burning. Her words trembled, but her eyes burned steady. She looked like the sort who had wept enough tears to drown in, but had chosen instead to walk through fire and keep going. Across the lantern circle sat the younger one, wiry and restless, scars crisscrossing his forearms, his fists clenched and unclenched as if the past was still inside him, begging for a fight. "They tried to break me," he spat. "Labor camp out by the border. Chains, whips, days of digging trenches for men who never lifted a shovel. I saw folks starve beside me, saw men whipped until they couldn't stand. But I ran through 3 nights with dogs at my heels. They never caught me, and I swore no man would chain me again." He leaned forward, firelight cutting across his face, and you could see in his eyes that vengeance was the only thing keeping him alive. The last to speak was the quiet hunter. He'd been listening the whole time, his face unreadable, his long coat dusted with trail grit. Slowly, he reached into the leather satchel at his side and drew out folded papers, stained, brittle, handled too many times. He set them on the table, and the lantern revealed what they were: records, maps, and crude sketches of massacres. Burned-out farms, grave sites unmarked but remembered in ink. "I keep count," he said, his voice little more than gravel. "Every wrong that goes unanswered piles higher. Every massacre the frontier forgets, I write it down. Men think blood disappears in the dirt, but dirt remembers, and I do too." The cabin fell silent at his words, the crackle of the lantern wick the only sound. It was the kind of silence that felt holy or cursed. That silence carried weight, but it also bound them. 4 strangers with nothing in common but loss, sitting together in a cabin with a ghost hanging over them, literally. Above their heads, carved into the beams, they began to notice markings. Strange gouges, circles, and crosses, crude words half erased by time. Signs of intimidation, left there by someone who had meant this place to be a warning. The rancher rose, lantern in hand, and held it high. The carvings caught the light, stretching shadows along the walls. "This ain't just lumber and nails," he muttered. "This place has seen blood, been made into a message." His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. And they wanted that girl to be part of it. The Apache girl, laid to rest outside beneath the oak, seemed to linger with them still. They hadn't known her name, hadn't heard her voice, but her presence filled the cabin. She was a reminder of everything they'd lost, and everything they had yet to fight for. None of them said it outright, but all felt it in the marrow of their bones. They would not let her death be forgotten. One by one, they looked at each other. The stoic rancher, the grieving woman, the fiery escapee, the silent hunter. And in that moment, strangers became something more. Not quite family, not yet, but bound by ghosts, by survival, and by a shared promise that whatever storm was coming, they would not face it alone. The night was as black as tar, the prairie swallowed in silence, until the first hoofbeat shattered it. At first it sounded like thunder rolling low across the plains, but then came another, and another, a dozen horses pounding the dirt, closing fast. The cabin walls trembled with their approach, lantern flame quivering as if the light itself was afraid. The survivors stiffened. The maternal woman pulled the young fiery one closer to her side, whispering for quiet, while the quiet hunter eased toward the window with a rifle half raised. The rancher didn't move. He stood tall in the middle of the cabin, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the door as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Then the riders arrived. Shadowy figures circled the cabin, masked faces hidden under wide brims. Their horses snorted steam into the freezing air. One of them bellowed, voice carried sharp across the night. "Leave the girl hanging, or you'll hang in her place." The survivors froze. The air grew tighter, thicker. That cabin was no longer shelter, it was a marked grave. Another rider fired his revolver into the sky, muzzle flash tearing the dark apart. The echo rattled through every timber of the cabin. Shots cracked again, wild, designed not to kill but to scare. The fiery youth spat on the floor. "Let 'em come." But his hands trembled against the stock of his rifle. The maternal woman shook her head, murmuring prayers. The quiet hunter watched through the crack in the shutters, counting the shadows outside. The rancher finally spoke. His voice was low even, but hard as iron. "They're not here for a warning. They're here to measure our fear," another shout came from the riders. "You bury her, you burn for it. She swings, or you will." Their laughter was cruel, echoing like coyotes on a carcass. And in that laughter was something deeper, a signature. Not the men themselves, but the hand behind them, the villain, a local power who fed on fear, who left bodies as messages. The hanged Apache girl had been his letter, nailed to the doorpost of this land. The rancher's jaw tightened. He gripped his rifle, knuckles pale in the lantern light. The choice was plain, cave to fear or stand against it. And in that long silence, with riders circling like wolves, the survivors made their decision. They would not leave. The cabin no longer felt like a home. It felt like a fort, a place meant to be tested by fire. After the riders' warning, nobody spoke of leaving. There was no talk of surrender. The survivors, ragged though they were, understood the truth in the prairie wind. Once a man has been marked, running only brings the noose closer. So they stayed and they prepared. The rancher was the first to move. He stacked planks across the windows, hammer echoing against the hollow walls. Splinters flew as he worked with a cold determination, sweat darkening his shirt even as the air grew heavy with the scent of a storm. One by one the others joined in. The fiery youth dragged logs against the door, muttering curses at the riders who thought they could scare him back into chains. The quiet hunter, silent as always, began rigging snares and trip lines along the perimeter, his hands steady, eyes calculating. Even the maternal woman, her face pale in lantern light, pressed strips of cloth into rags, ready for bandages, ready for blood. By nightfall, the cabin walls seemed thicker, each nail and board holding not just wood, but a sliver of their will to survive. Inside, the rancher laid out the rifles he had gathered. The iron gleamed faintly under the lamp's glow. He picked up one rifle, handed it to the youth. "Hold it steady," he said, voice gravelly, low. The boy raised it, hands trembling. The rancher placed his own hands over his, guiding the barrel. "Don't fight the kick. Breathe with it." A single shot rang out into the darkness, tearing through a tin can perched on a fence post. The boy's eyes widened. For the first time, he believed he could strike back. Later, they gathered around the small table for a meal. Salt pork and beans, hard bread softened in broth. They ate without joy, but together. The hunter bowed his head and whispered a prayer. Not for victory, but for steadiness of heart. The room fell quiet. Outside, thunder grumbled low, like distant drums. When they finished, the rancher led them beyond the cabin. Beneath the great oak tree, they lowered the Apache girl into the earth. No words were spoken, only stones stacked into a marker. The rancher pressed the final rock into place and whispered, "You'll not be forgotten." In that moment, they were no longer strangers. They were bound by a shared grave, a shared defiance. As the first drops of rain struck the earth, each survivor returned to the cabin. Lanterns flickered against faces drawn tight with fear, but lit from within by something stronger. The storm was gathering outside and in. Steel was sharpened, ropes cut, guns loaded. The cabin was ready. So were they. The prairie was not quiet that morning. Dawn had barely split the horizon when the hoofbeats came, low at first, then thundering like a storm rolling across the open plains. From inside the cabin, the survivors could feel it. Wooden walls vibrating, dust drifting from the rafters. The rancher pressed his hand to the window frame, eyes narrowed. His cabin, bought for 12 cents, was about to be baptized in blood. Smoke from last night's lanterns still clung to the air. The survivors readied themselves in silence. The maternal woman stood with trembling hands over the boy she had shielded, whispering a prayer. The fiery youth crouched by the door, one hand gripping a torch, the other a powder horn ready to ignite the traps they had laid. The quiet hunter checked his rifle with the calm of a man long used to killing. And the rancher? He stood at the center, iron-jawed, revolver at his hip, shotgun across his arm. His eyes were dark hollows that promised no retreat. Then the war cry split the morning. A dozen riders came sweeping out of the mist, rifles flashing, their leader's banner snapping like a serpent's tongue in the wind. Bullets ripped into the cabin's face, splintering wood, shattering glass. The survivors ducked as shards rained across the floor. The boy screamed, but was pulled down into the maternal woman's arms. She rocked him once, then pushed him under the table with the ferocity of a mother wolf. The first wave hit hard. Bullets tore through the shutters. A shot grazed the hunter's hat. He did not flinch. With slow breath, he raised his rifle, sighted through the broken pane, and fired. One rider toppled backward, boots slipping from the stirrups, body thudding against the prairie dust. The others howled, circling wider. The fiery youth lit his torch, flame licking high. "Now!" he snarled. He hurled it into the line of powder laid across the porch. Fire roared like a dragon. Horses reared, panicked, scattering men who cursed and fired wildly into the smoke. The smell of burnt hair and charred wood mixed with gunpowder, choking the air inside the cabin. But the defenders held. The second wave came on foot. Men ducked low, creeping toward the walls. The hunter dropped two with calm precision, but more pressed forward. Bullets punched holes into the log walls, daylight streaming through like narrow knives. The maternal woman dragged a wounded survivor across the floor, her apron soaking red, but her eyes burning with defiance. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Stay with me or die here." Then the door buckled. A shoulder slammed against it, again and again until the latch burst. The villain himself strode in, tall, scarred, eyes gleaming with cruel certainty. He carried a long blade in one hand, revolver in the other. His men swarmed behind him. The cabin exploded into chaos. The fiery youth lunged with a broken chair leg, driving it into one intruder's gut. The maternal woman swung a skillet, iron-cracking bone. The hunter emptied his rifle, reloading in a blur. And the rancher met the villain in the center of the room, where the dirt floor had been worn thin by pacing boots. The two men clashed like bulls in a pen too small. Gunfire deafened the room, smoke veiling them in ghostly haze. The villain's blade flashed, carving across the rancher's arm, blood streaming down to his fingertips. The rancher answered with his fists, each blow like a hammer striking iron. They grappled, stumbled, locked together in violence older than words. Chairs shattered, lanterns toppled, flames licking at the floorboards. The villain pressed the revolver under the rancher's chin. "This land ain't yours," he hissed. The rancher shoved the barrel aside, steel burning his jaw, and snarled back, "It is now." They wrestled for control, blade against barrel, strength against fury. The villain's grin widened as he forced the rancher to his knees. But the rancher, bloodied and heaving, drove his forehead forward with a crack that broke the villain's nose. Stunned, the villain staggered. In that heartbeat of silence, the rancher drew his own revolver from the dirt, leveled it, and fired. The shot echoed like thunder through the cabin. For a moment, everything stilled. Smoke curled, dust floated in shafts of light, and the villain stood swaying before collapsing face first into the dirt. His men, seeing their leader fall, broke and scattered, their shouts fading into the prairie wind. Inside, the cabin was quiet, but for the sound of ragged breathing. Survivors leaned against walls, bloodied, trembling, yet alive. The maternal woman clutched the boy close. The fiery youth dropped his torch and laughed bitterly, chest heaving. The hunter simply lowered his rifle, expression unreadable. The rancher stood alone in the center, revolver smoking in his grip, staring down at the body of the man who thought fear could own the plains. He dropped the weapon to his side, exhaled slow, and in the silence that followed, the cabin itself seemed to breathe again. The siege was over. But nothing about that dawn would ever be forgotten. The prairie was silent after the storm of gunfire. Smoke clung to the air, bitter and black, curling from shattered wood and burned rope. The survivors staggered from the cabin, their boots crunching over broken glass and blood-soaked dirt. What had once been a battlefield now looked eerily still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then it came. First, a distant rumble, rolling low across the plains. A moment later, the heavens opened. Fat drops of rain splattered onto their faces, their coats, the ground where bodies had fallen. The rain cut through the stench of powder and sweat, washing away streaks of crimson into the thirsty soil. Each drop carried a strange weight, cleansing, heavy, almost merciful. The rancher stood tall in the downpour, hat in hand, hair plastered to his forehead. For the first time since entering that cursed cabin, his face softened. His eyes lifted to the clouds as though he knew the storm was not punishment, but release. Beside him, the fiery youth knelt, letting the water roll down her scarred knuckles. The maternal woman clutched a shard of wood from the doorframe, tears mingling with rain as if the sky wept with her. Even the quiet hunter, so stoic through battle, bowed his head, lips moving in a silent prayer. When the storm eased into a steady drizzle, they set to work. No words were spoken, only the rhythm of rebuilding filled the silence. Boards were hammered into place, shattered glass replaced with rough planks, and the door was braced upright again. Each strike of the hammer echoed like a vow. This cabin will not remain a tomb. Out beneath the oak tree, the rancher carved into the wood with his knife, each stroke careful and deliberate. A cross slowly took shape above the freshly piled stones of the Apache girl's grave. When it was finished, he untied the last of the rope, the same rope that had marked her humiliation and death, and set it aflame. They stood together, watching it burn to ash in the rain, firelight flickering against their faces before being snuffed by the water. No victory cries, no boasting. Only a quiet bond between survivors who had shared blood, fear, and redemption. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance, but a chosen family forged in fire and storm. The prairie wind rose again, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint memory of smoke, and for the first time, the cabin did not feel cursed. It felt alive,